So guys, we have to talk about Elizabeth Warren's terrible position on Bolivia. In a lot of ways, I've defended Warren. I'm still a Sanders guy 100%, but I've tried to give her time and time again the benefit of the doubt, even when she maybe didn't deserve it. Whether it was on Medicare for All or campaign finance reform, I've tried to give her some leeway based on the fact that besides Bernie, she's clearly the best option for the Democratic nomination. But when she takes positions like she has on Bolivia, and when you add that together with all her other awful positions, I have to say that Warren, in my mind, should be disqualified from progressive support in this 2020 Democratic primary, leaving Bernie Sanders as the literal only option. No Tulsi, no Warren, no anybody else. It's Bernie or bust. It has to be at this point. Because with Bolivia as a key example, nobody else has been willing to stand against the anti-indigenous and anti-democratic and anti-socialist coup in that country. Let's take a look at Elizabeth Warren's quote-unquote statement on this that she released on Twitter. The Bolivian people deserve free and fair elections as soon as possible. Bolivia's interim leadership must limit itself to preparing for an early, legitimate election. Bolivia's security forces must protect demonstrators, not commit violence against them. That's awful, guys. It might not read as awful on first glance if you're not following the situation, but the implications of what's being said and what's not being said there is awful, and it's tantamount to endorsing a military coup as legitimate. So Warren basically says that they need a legitimate election. There was a legitimate election. I don't care what the Organization of American States says. I don't care what the anti-indigenous and anti-socialist forces in Bolivia say. Evo Morales won a legitimate election, and he is the legitimate president of Bolivia. And talking about this transitional regime, quote unquote, is basically tantamount to acknowledging that these Christo-fascists are running the show now, and they're a legitimate transitional force. We've seen what they've done to protesters, what they've done to indigenous symbols, what they've done to trade unionists, to indigenous people, and to anybody who is deemed even somewhat connected to Evo Morales and his political party and movement. It's been a systemic, violent crackdown on any potential force of resistance to the coup in Bolivia. This is in no way about a transition towards a democratic election, and is in reality a departure from democracy, given that the country was plunged into this thuggish anarchy not by Morales and his people, but by threats of violence against Morales and his supporters by the thugs and by the military. That's what this is all about. There's no mention here about Morales' fight for indigenous people and working class people. There's no mention here about the combined interests of the elites inside and outside Bolivia to replace a government that was fighting for regular people and for the public ownership of key natural resources in Bolivia. And of course, as I noted, she does not use the word coup. That word is incredibly important. Most mainstream media, most politicians have tried to avoid that C word because at the end of the day, they don't want to acknowledge the fact that Morales was the democratically legitimate president of that country, and that what we're seeing there is a group of white Christian nationalists overthrowing an indigenous socialist government to implement right-wing policies that are anti-democratic in nature. That's what's happening. But because that right-wing Christian nationalist, white nationalist government actually promotes the interests of Canadian mining companies, of American mining companies, of tech companies like Tesla, given that, Bolivia has the sort of metals that are needed for the 21st century technologies that these companies depend on. This is not a coup. It can't be seen as such. It can't be. Because if it is, we have to reckon with the fact that we are the bad guys, that Canada, the United States, we are the bad guys. And that even quote-unquote progressives like Justin Trudeau and Elizabeth Warren are just trying to legitimize this coup as the savior of democracy rather than its death knell in Bolivia. That's what's really troubling here. Bernie Sanders got it right. Jagmeet Singh here in Canada got it right. Jeremy Corbyn in Britain got it right. The left-wing leaders in Anglosphere countries got it right, while the quote-unquote progressive centrist-type leaders like Warren and Trudeau and those other folks either have been silent or have gotten it wrong. And that's what really matters here. Elizabeth Warren's position on Bolivia and Venezuela shows to me that she is not dedicated to a global left movement, whereas Bernie Sanders is. And that's incredibly important. Bernie Sanders realizes that to build the movement that's going to outlast him and, this election and the next couple elections, it's not just about winning the presidency. It's about building a grassroots progressive movement in the United States, but also building the bonds of solidarity beyond American borders, because that's what it's going to take to challenge globalized neoliberalism. There's no other way. You can't do it in one country. Even the most powerful, richest, most prestigious country in the world, like the United States, can't end neoliberalism on its own. It needs allies across the world, in other rich countries, but in developing countries as well. And Elizabeth Warren seems to reject that. She seems to reject the need for greater solidarity beyond the American borders. She has not stood up for democratic forces in Latin America, resisting hard right, anti-democratic, anti-indigenous actors, simply because those people are fighting for the interests of some of America's richest and most powerful people and corporations. That shows to me that Elizabeth Warren can talk about good social programs in the United States, although she's not a supporter of Medicare for all. But what does that mean when you're building it on the backs of poor people, of indigenous people, of working class people in the developing world? That's not really the mark of a left leader. The fight for a better world has to be a fight for a better world. And it's also crucial to realize that the President of the United States has great levers of power, especially when it pertains to foreign policy. They're not an island unto themselves. They're still held in check by the Congress, the House and Senate. But in terms of foreign policy, the president has a great ability to express a vision for what America should do globally in a way that they're more hamstrung domestically by Congress. And so, when Bernie Sanders becomes president and he can show open and unabashed solidarity with progressive movements, with indigenous movements, with workers' movements in the developing world, in the American sphere of Latin America, that will make a vital difference. And while I have no doubt that Elizabeth Warren is going to be better than most on domestic policy, and she is going to fight for good progressive policy at home, at least in relation to the rest of the Democratic field, and of course in relation to Donald Trump, she is no ally to working class people the world over, and she will continue an American foreign policy that hurts people abroad and that prevents them from achieving the sorts of rights and freedoms and opportunities that America prides itself on, as a beacon to the world. That's why Elizabeth Warren is no ally to the global working class, and that's why Bernie Sanders has to be the only choice, the only one who can carry the banner of left-wing ideas into the Democratic nomination and therefore into the presidency and therefore across the globe.